Instruments of the orchestra. This is Austin Putt from 1521 Studios and Austin Putt's Music Theory and Aural Perception. Visit us online at www.1521studios.com. During the course of your musical studies, at some point you will be asked to identify the most common instruments in Western music, using just your ears. This is meant to be a guide, displaying how each instrument in the standard classical orchestra sounds. You should know the range and timbre of each major instrument without fail. This guide will include the major instruments of the string, woodwind, and brass sections, as well as a few instruments from the percussion section. At this point, it should be easy to determine what section an instrument belongs to. This guide is geared more for discerning between instruments in the same section, as this can be more difficult. Throughout the course of this, you'll hear each instrument play the same melodic line in different octaves, more or less depending on how wide the range is for each given instrument. I highly recommend listening to this through a good set of earbuds or headphones. We'll start with the string section. This section almost always has the most playing time. Though there are some different seating arrangements, the strings are usually placed in the front of the orchestra, fanning around the conductor in a high to low arrangement. These instruments produce sound by moving a bow across the strings to force vibration. The violin. There are typically two sections labeled Violin 1 and Violin 2, the latter usually taking the lower lines. The violin is tuned in fifths, G, D, A, E. This is a solo violin playing our melodic line. A string section can vary in size, but a typical size for a violin section is 14 players. This is a section of 14 violins playing the melodic line. The viola. The viola sounds very much like the violin, and the two are often mistaken for each other. The viola is slightly larger and is often said to sound full and dark in comparison to the violin. It's also tuned in fifths, but a fifth lower, C, G, D, A. Here's a solo viola. Here's a section of 12 violas. The violoncello. The cello is a lot larger than the previous two instruments. It's placed on the floor, upright, with a stand called an end pin, and is placed between the performer's legs. It typically covers the baritone range for the section, but with its wide range, it can also play fairly high melodies as well as cover bass parts. It often doubles the double bass parts an octave higher. The cello is tuned just like a viola, but an octave lower, C, G, D, A. This is a solo cello. This is a section of 10 cellos. The double bass. The double bass is simply huge. I don't envy anyone who has to carry one around. Like the cello, it rests on the floor with an end pin, but is considerably larger. A performer either stands or sits on a high stool. The double bass can have a very low and boomy sound, typically playing as low as an E1, but can even go lower than that with a different tuning, an extension, or a 5-string bass. Its typical tuning is set in fourths, E, A, D, G. This is a solo double bass. This is a section of 8 double basses. The woodwind section. Just like the string section, the number of players can vary, but typically there are 2 of each instrument, or 1 or 2 of each and a variation, such as a flute and piccolo, oboe and English horn, bassoon and contrabassoon, or clarinet and bass clarinet. The woodwind section usually sits in the middle of the orchestra, right behind the strings. The flute. The flute usually gets the highest lines in the woodwind section. There are different flute variations, including the bass flute, alto flute, and piccolo, but we won't be discussing these. We'll be sticking to the main instruments. The lower range of the flute is quieter, but it gets brighter and more volume is possible at the higher notes. This is a flute. The oboe. The oboe, along with the bassoon, is considered a double reed instrument. It can, at many times, stick out like a sore thumb because it has a very nasal quality to it. Because of this, it often takes melodies. Here's the oboe. The clarinet. The clarinet is a transposing instrument. The most common are B-flat clarinets, though you will see A clarinets and a smaller E-flat clarinet, as well as a bass version. The clarinet has a dark, airy sound in the low range and can get quite shrill in the high range. Here's the clarinet. The bassoon. The bassoon is the low range of the woodwinds and is almost like a very large oboe, though its tone is not quite like it. It can be thought of as the cello of the woodwind section, and its range is very similar. There's also a bass version called the contrabassoon. This is the bassoon. The brass section. The brass section encompasses the most powerful instruments and is often used for that purpose. Again, the number of players can vary. Every brass instrument is sounded by a mouthpiece in which the performer must make a buzzing vibration with his or her lips while expelling a stream of air through metal tubing. The horn. This is usually the largest section of the brass with 4 separate parts. Many times a 5th player is utilized. This player typically plays the first part alongside the first chair to assist because rest is often required. The horn is a particularly difficult instrument to play and control due to the tiny size of the mouthpiece and air pressure. The right hand is placed inside the bell and can change the timbre and pitch if need be. The horn is a transposing instrument, and the most common are F horns. The horn has a huge range for a brass instrument. The first and third chair players are usually considered the high-range players, and they're most often high-range specialists. The second and fourth chair are the low-range specialists. The horn can sound from quiet, soft, and round to loud and piercing. Horns are often called on during both woodwind passages and brass passages. They sit behind the woodwinds in the center or to the left. As a side note, there's no need to call it the French horn. In many circles, one could lose credibility by calling it that. Simply refer to it as the horn. Here is a solo horn. Here's a section of 5 horns. The trumpet. The trumpet has had many variations for hundreds of years. Today, we most often use the B-flat or the C trumpet. It usually takes the highest lines and many melodies, especially in loud, powerful sections of music. 2 or 3 trumpets are usually implemented in most orchestras. They sit behind the woodwinds to the right. This is the solo trumpet. This is a section of 3 trumpets. The trombone. The trombone is widely known for its ability to slide from note to note, though this technique isn't used as often as you might think in the orchestra. They cover a lot of mid-range and low-range passages. They can also get very loud, and they sound a little shrill, even in the low range at high volumes. There are usually 3 trombones in the section, and they sit behind the trumpets on the right. This is a solo trombone. This is a section of 3 trombones. The tuba. The tuba is the largest and lowest sounding of the brass instruments. It has a very similar range to the double bass. As with all brass instruments, it can play at very high volume levels. There's usually 1 tuba in an orchestra, and it sits to the right of the trombones. This is a tuba. The percussion section. There are a few common instruments in this section, but there are many percussion instruments, and it all varies depending on what's called for. There are 2 different families of percussion, pitched and unpitched. A pitched percussion instrument would be something like a marimba, xylophone, or timpani. An unpitched percussion instrument would be something like a bass drum, snare drum, or cymbals. We won't touch on these because they're not difficult to identify. Of all the many percussion instruments that can be found in an orchestra, we'll touch on just a few that may be difficult to distinguish. The timpani. This isn't terribly difficult to identify, but it's one percussion instrument that's almost always included. Usually you'll see 4 timpani surrounding their player, but musical pieces many times call for less. Different mallets can be used to create different timbres. For this example, we'll use the most common mallet, which is felt-tipped. Timpani come in different sizes and they can be tuned to different pitches. Modern timpani have a foot pedal that can tighten or loosen the drumhead to create different pitches very quickly. The pitches are usually tuned in the key. The xylophone. The xylophone is a pitched percussion instrument that encompasses a mid and high range. It's usually struck with hard-tipped mallets. It has a very hard percussive attack with a very fast decay. This is the xylophone. The marimba. The marimba is considerably larger than the xylophone. It has a very wide range and is sometimes played by more than one person at a time. It's not nearly as bright as the xylophone, but still has a fast percussive strike and a relatively short decay. The sound is round and full. This is the marimba. That covers the most common instruments in the 4 sections of the orchestra. Listen to these samples carefully and multiple times if you need to.